Hey, it's Mr. Aiken here. We're back with our next lesson. We've only got a couple weeks left, and we're kind of jumping around again. We had lots of topics that we're not going to be able to cover. I'm trying to hit the most important ones. Last week we'd finished up China, and so this week we are going to be talking about India, which we had talked about briefly before the shutdown began. So we might be thinking back a little bit to what we had talked about here. So this is kind of our review. We know that India was under the control at one point of the British East India Company. Remember, it was an actual company owning essentially a country. That is until the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. Remember, sepoys were Indians that were a part of the military, and they tried to fight back and push against this British rule. And all it ended up doing was transfer the rule to the British government. So now the actual country of Great Britain was in control of India. And so India, just like Africa, we had talked about all of the different places in Africa being taken by countries of Europe. Just like that, India, which is over here in orange, was ruled by Great Britain, this tiny island country over here in green. And now they were taking their resources, they were selling their products to the people of India, they were enlisting Indians in the British military, and it was really kind of an unfair situation for the people of India. The people of Britain were kind of pushing their own laws, customs, and religions. They were really trying to keep the Indians from pushing back and trying to become an independent country because Great Britain was profiting a lot off of controlling this very important area that we've discussed as being important all the way back even into first semester. Right, it was one of the places that the countries of Europe wanted to get to because of its access to certain natural resources. Now, in 1914, as we discussed a few weeks ago, World War I broke out, and it was a world war, right? It included most countries that existed at the time, and that included the people of India. So, because they were under the control of the British, they end up sending 800,000 soldiers to fight for the British in this war. That is a lot of people going to fight for a country that is essentially controlling them. They were not fighting on behalf of India, they were fighting on behalf of Great Britain and the Allies. So when they went, they fought. Many soldiers, of course, die in war, and so the ones that come home were, quote unquote, here welcomed home. And the reason being is that the people of India saw this as a chance for them to possibly gain their independence. Maybe if they joined the military, showed the British how loyal they were, fought and died for the cause, that maybe the British would then say, okay, we're going to grant India its independence. It helped increase this Indian nationalism, right? Helped make them feel like they were a part of their own country rather than a part of Britain. Unfortunately, the British weren't going to see it that way. The British said, okay, thank you for fighting in the war, but that's what you're expected to do as a colony. We're not going to grant you your independence. And the people of India were not too happy to hear that. So in 1919, Britain is going to start to push even more control over the people of India as kind of unrest starts to begin, right? The people of India say, can we have our independence? And the British say, no, we need to make sure that we keep this colony and keep things the way that it is. So in 1919, the Rowlatt Acts allow the British to harshly enforce their rule, imprisoning protesters without trial. So essentially, they say the soldiers that are keeping control of India on behalf of Britain can do whatever they need to do to keep control. And an example of where this went wrong was something called the Amritsar Massacre, where peaceful protesters were going out and saying that they wanted to have at least more control over their government, right? Because at this point they don't even have a say in their own laws that they have to follow. The protest gets violent and ends up with 400 Indians being killed. So it's events like this that really start to push the ideas of a very important figure in India then, and one that we still talk about and know his name now. You might recognize a picture of him. His name is Gandhi. So Mohandas Gandhi grew up in India, but actually received an education abroad. So he was a fairly wealthy person growing up. He became a lawyer in Great Britain, traveled to South Africa for part of his life as well. But what he believed in, what his main goal was enacting change through nonviolence and civil disobedience. So, nonviolence obviously means not getting physical, not trying to kind of attack the British, but rather using nonviolent protests. Think things like sit ins, things like hunger strikes, things like that. And also through civil disobedience. Now, that is a very fancy term, but what civil disobedience is it's when you break a law on purpose because you feel that the law shouldn't be in place. So let's say the British had a law that said that Indians were not allowed to be out past 7 o'clock, something like a curfew, right? And the Indians think that that's unfair. Civil disobedience would be purposefully going out past that curfew in order to protest it, to say this is wrong, this shouldn't be a law, this shouldn't be something that the people have to follow. And so Gandhi is going to be this important figure that starts to lead these nonviolent protests against the British rule throughout the 1920s and 1930s. He becomes a very well-known figure. So part of it was to hit Britain where it was going to hurt the most, and that was in their wallet, right? The reason Britain had control of India was because they were trying to make money, and so two things that they found that they could do to protest the British control was cloth. So they start to make their own clothes, and against British salt. So Indians began to produce their own salt rather than buy it from the British. So that is why when you see pictures of Gandhi, he's often wearing these very, very plain robes. They're usually handmade. They're protesting the fact that they're not going to buy British cloth. We're going to this slide. So one of his most famous protests was called the Salt March, and it happened for about 30 days between March and April of 1930. And what they were doing is kind of gathering a large group of people that were going to say, we're going to protest the use of British salt, and we're going to walk to the sea, and we're going to make our own salt ourselves. And so over the course of that 30 days, about 60,000 Indians, including Gandhi, are arrested, really despite the fact that they weren't doing anything. This was a completely nonviolent protest. It was just them walking to protest British salt. So it really became an example of the British enforcing a very harsh rule against the people of India. So here's a picture of that, of Gandhi and some of his followers making the march. You can see that they're wearing very simple clothing, right? Those handmade clothing, but also being nonviolent. So eventually in 1935, the British are going to cave at least a little bit in giving the Indians some degree of self-rule. They're going to give them a spot in their government where the Indians could have some representation for themselves. It's not entirely independence yet. That won't happen until after World War II and in 1947, which we'll talk about in the second half of the lesson later. But it was a step in the right direction that showed that Gandhi and his protests were working, and that the British were seeing and hearing this, and the rest of the world was starting to take notice too of the fact that these nonviolent protests were often ending with the British becoming violent and arresting people for seemingly no reason. So I'll end it here. You've probably seen some of these quotes, right? Gandhi, very important figure, very influential. Even today, people look to him as an example of peace and an example of ways to fight back against things that you find are unfair. So we still talk about and know who Gandhi is to this day.